Awesome. So thanks for joining us, everyone. Today we're talking with Jamie Quint. He's head of growth over at Notion. Before this, he was at Reddit as a PM, leading monetization, I think. And before that, he did his own startup in the ad tech space. And he also has worked with lots of startups on growth things. I don't know if you saw the tweet about me saying, hey, I'm doing this event with Jamie. At least two people responded and said, why do you need growth if you have a good product? So I thought that'd be a funny question to start on. So what does growth do? And do you need it if you have a good product?
I think to some extent, having a good product does solve for growth itself, but good product in that sense basically means a product that's already been optimized to grow. In the case of Notion, it's a product that's kind of inherently viral because one of the primary use cases is using it with other people. So that's kind of already built into the product, and it really has that going for it in the same way a product like Facebook, for example, would have. It's better if you don't use it by yourself, right? And Notion's a little bit different in that you can use it by yourself, which actually probably helps because there's a single user use case, and then you can kind of move into like multi-user use case over time, which obviously you can't with something like Facebook or Slack. But yeah, I think having a good product or a product that's inherently viral does a lot of it for you. But there's a lot of successful products that's not quite enough, and you can always do better than kind of the base case of having a good product, which is almost never a fully optimized product.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned Facebook, which is like the most viral of all products, and they actually popularized a growth team, right? Like they're the ones that did it first and like systematized it.
Yeah.
What do you think of mistakes that founders often make early on when they think about growth? I guess maybe focusing on products that aren't like inherently kind of viral.
I think the biggest mistake is that people focus on growth too early. Kind of going back to the first question, all the growth stuff can't save you from a bad product, or not even a bad product, but a product that doesn't have product market fit. I really don't think you solve product market fit with growth tactics and growth hacking. I just don't really believe in that. I think that there's products that have done that successfully, or even done it successfully and then got acquired. But then there's products that did that and grew really fast and then just completely failed. So a kind of example that I don't know if everyone will remember would be like Vidi, and they just kind of optimized this viral growth for this video product by hacking like the growth in the Facebook feed, but they had basically no retention and they grew really big. And I think they raised like $60 million or something like that, and their growth graph just went up and then like straight back down, because as soon as like the Facebook growth engine stopped, like none of the users were actually users, they were just kind of passing through. And I think people make that mistake too often, where they're focusing on not creating an innovative product that users love, but just kind of doing this growth hacking stuff.
Yeah, I would actually go as far as to say that's like, assuming you ever launch anything after that phase, that's probably like the main reason startups fail. It's like they just don't have a retentive enough product. Are you a fan of, have you seen Rahul's like product market fit kind of measure?
Yeah.
Are you a fan of that, or like do you kind of think like it's mostly like a percentage of retention or something like that to figure out like if something is like works well enough to like bother doing growth tactics on?
Yeah, so Rahul's thing really originated actually from Sean Ellis, who originally came up with the questions for, we would call determining if you have product market fit, which I think was 40% of people would say they'd be very disappointed if they couldn't use your product anymore. I think Rahul took it a step further, where he was like trying to debug the difference between the people who were in that 40%, the people who weren't, based on like a feature set, and like how do we work on particular features in order to move from like not product market fit to product market fit. I actually thought that was pretty smart and a decent way of thinking about it. I don't think it's like the only way of thinking about it necessarily. Like a lot of times there's people who just kind of go off in a quarter and build a product, and then they come out and it's like all of a sudden 40% of people are like, I love this thing. And I would say that actually happens like quite a bit of the time. You just have product market fit from the outset, and then other times you really have to struggle to kind of get there. And I actually think the most successful companies are usually the ones who end up coming out of the gate with some amount of product market fit. I'm trying to think of a good example where they really struggled for like years and years and then got there. Maybe something like Twitch.
Just super high level, what are all the things that are part of growth? Like, hey, we're talking about kind of retention and things like that. Like, yeah, what are all the kind of pieces that you think are like, this is the growth stack?
The things that I think of are obviously the product focused levers for growth. So, what can you do in onboarding? What can you do with invites? What can you do with notifications? How do you integrate all those things into the product in a sensible way? I guess I really think of growth as, how do you debug the problems that users are having with your product that are preventing them from achieving their goals, and then remove the barriers and obstacles from their way, rather than like some hacks to like trick people to do things. Outside of that, I think performance marketing often falls into kind of the growth bucket, where you're doing really quantitative marketing and trying to think about how you acquire users for a particular dollar amount. Another thing that I've seen fall under growth more at like larger companies nowadays is something that people are starting to call like growth platform. And you have all these kind of software tools from, analytics to email to, push notifications to like all these different things that are administrated in various different tools, whether it be like outreach on the sales side or like a customer IO or, Braze or something like that on the email and push notification side to, whatever, maybe you're doing marketing in parallel and you have to coordinate your marketing audiences for paid marketing with those email audiences and push notification audiences, and like owning the underlying software stack to make sure all that stuff works smoothly together and works with like the data and the data team that you have.
So if a small team, let's say sub 15 people, let's assume you have some level of product market fit and you want to do more in growth. That's like a lot of tools you just kind of reeled off. What is like the minimum viable growth tech stack that like you think small companies need?
At the base, it's just analytics. I think that's like the first piece, and everything can be built on top of that. I think for small companies, using something like Amplitude is great. Amplitude's a great product. Highly recommend using it. I think as you start to get bigger, then you think about like, how do I get a data warehouse in place? How do I organize all the data there? How do I do more complex queries than I can do in Amplitude? But that comes like probably past 15 people, once you are getting to the edges of what something like Amplitude can do. I would say that for SaaS companies, having a good handle on revenue is obviously very important. Profitwell is like an amazing tool, and it's actually free. So if you're a SaaS company, you should definitely check that out.
I guess like approaching kind of a company that hasn't got too much growth, like products in place, what's your framework for like analyzing like, hey, these are the levers we should like focus on in the short term or medium term?
Yeah, I mean, I try actually not to work on stuff that doesn't have too much growth, because I don't think I can actually help that much. For companies that are struggling to grow, it's really more an innovation problem, not like a growth problem. And so,
sorry, I kind of meant more that let's say they're growing, but like they don't have, they've not done any performance ads. They haven't done any of this kind of growth centric ways of growing, rather than just like organic growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the first thing is to like ensure that the growth is legitimate. And like what I tend to look at for determining that is retention. I think it's like one of the most important metrics, and you want your retention to be like reasonably high, but most importantly stable. So at some point, X months into using the product, or weeks or whatever, you have the same percentage of users that started in a given cohort still using it, and that number is either flat or curving slightly back up because you're bringing some users back. Obviously, if that number is just going down perpetually, then you're in a world where you just have to keep acquiring users forever, which is not a good place to be. Assuming you already have that in place, then it really depends on the product. So for something like consumer e-commerce, then you're going to start thinking about, how do I find more marketing channels, or how do I start finding scalable marketing channels, whereas like I've just been using word of mouth to date, but word of mouth, you only have so much control over scaling it as like an e-commerce product. If you're like a product like Facebook, then you probably start thinking about like, what are the growth loops that exist inherently within my product? Or for Reddit, for example, so Reddit's like growth loop basically is like people come to the site, they read all this like interesting content, some percentage of them sign up and become really engaged, then some percentage of those people create content, and then that content, like people find it via search or via someone sharing the link or whatever, and that drives users in and the cycle continues. And so I think you're either trying to find performance channels that work, or you're trying to find and optimize like natural growth loops within your product.
Like when you do think about like experimenting with a new channel, let's just say you want to do Facebook ads for an e-commerce thing or something like that, what's your process for like starting that experiment?
On the performance side of things, I usually just try and educate myself first by talking to people who have run the channel before. I think this is like an underused tactic by a lot of people. A lot of people just jump in and try and figure it out, but a lot of times if you just talk to 5 people who've done this at scale before, they can just either tell you, I wouldn't use that if I were you, or if you're going to do this, this is how I would think about it, or here's some stuff to know. And I would just try and run some small scale tests and see, specifically on performance, I'm looking to see if I'm like within a certain range of what I would consider to be good. And that's like, maybe I'm within 50% of the numbers I want to see. And then I'll make the kind of assumption that if we invest a lot more effort into that channel, we can get from something that's like performing at 50% what we want to like 150% what we want eventually. With the more like less on the paid side, usually what I try and do is just debug where the highest leverage problem is. And so in a given like growth funnel, or like a growth loop, kind of cycle, or within just like a conversion funnel, I would map out the steps, and then usually there's some step where you have more leverage than other steps. So for example, like if you have like a 3-step funnel and you're losing a third of the people at the first step, and then like 10% of the people at the second step, and then like 1% of the people at the third step, most of the time, well, in the last step, you can only go from 99% to 100%. So there's not like that much improvement you can get. You can get like a 1 point whatever percent improvement. On the middle step, it's like much higher, and the first step, it's much higher. And then just kind of look at that and come up with ideas as to like, okay, here's where the most leverage is. How do we try and move this first? Because that's what's going to produce like the largest gains.
Is the effect of those improvements like more so when there's like a viral loop in there, right? Like for something like Facebook has like a K factor or something, and like when that's above 1, it's like an exponential effect. Is that do those kind of improvements really like matter more when you're dealing with something that has like a strong loop?
Yeah, and it can. A long time, like, I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I did some math in terms of like what matters more, retention or virality. And a lot of times, people are like, well, virality is really important because I want to grow exponentially. But a lot of times you can grow exponentially faster if you just improve your retention first and then focus on virality. So I think that's like an important thing to note. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're improving a conversion funnel from paid advertising, at the end of the day, you're spending some money for a click, and then that can't convert at higher than 100% rate. Whereas like if you're driving like a viral loop, like you can get 3 users for every user, and then that, snowballs pretty quickly. But not everyone has a product where that makes sense. And like generally, if you're trying to hack that on to a product where it doesn't make sense, it's just not going to work anyways.
When you think about channels, like, does it make sense to just focus on the big ones like Facebook and Google SEM and things like that, or is it worth experimenting with like smaller ones like, I don't know, Snapchat or something?
I think a lot of times new channels are where a lot of opportunity is. And if you figure out a new channel first, that can be a sustainable advantage for you. So a lot of these really successful, e-commerce brands, and I worked with a couple, sort of worked with Everlane like back in the day on a consulting basis, and they really figured out Facebook before a lot of other people, and that was like a big part of how they were able to grow, and it was a big part of how like a lot of these direct-to-consumer e-commerce companies were able to grow early on in back in like 2013. It's like Facebook released lookalike audiences, and then that really became the way that, and still is the way that a lot of these e-commerce brands pay to acquire customers, but it was like 10 times cheaper like 6 or 7 years ago. So if you can find that channel where it's not saturated yet and really figure out how to do it well, it can be a pretty sustainable advantage. I know a bunch of brands that were early to like podcasts, and that worked really well for them. There are a bunch of brands that figured out like Taboola and Outbrain, which was like the news articles like at the bottom of like CNN, but they would do ones where it was like, I don't know, there's some brands that still do this a lot, like Blinkist is like one of them. They just have like we hire the smartest people or something, and then you click through in the article and it's like about selling these book summaries. So I think there's value in being early to a channel.
How do you think about like how quickly a paid channel has to like pay off? Like I've heard some people say, I guess more for e-commerce, like it should pay off in the first transaction. Other people think about it more like a payoff like a year into the life. Is there like a magic number here?
I mean, it just depends on your business. Because like, if you're selling toothpaste or something, it's just not going to pay off the first time, but it's like a product that people are going to buy a lot. If you're selling mattresses, then you should probably pay off the first time because it's just not like a product that people are going to buy a lot. So I think it really just depends on the recurrence rate. And so yeah, I think good to aim for is like payback within a year. I think a lot of people trick themselves too, because they're like, oh, I spent $100 to drive $100 of revenue, but then they're like a clothing brand, and it's like, well, the clothes cost like $25 of revenue, and then like there's all these other costs too, and so they'll spend all this money like acquiring customers, which works as long as they can continue to raise money, but it's not really profitable acquisition when you take everything into account. So I think folks should keep more of a close eye on that, but I think about a year to 18 months is probably reasonable.
Any advice on how to grow an enterprise SaaS productivity product?
Enterprise SaaS, I mean, the standard playbook for that is more, I think, based on this book called Predictable Revenue. I forget who wrote it, but that was kind of the whole, you have SDRs, and these SDRs do like outbound email, and they drive leads, and just kind of the whole orchestration of that workflow using tools like Outreach and SalesLoft or whatever, and then you drive them to talk to account executive, and you're just trying to optimize this entire flow, and the marketing becomes very enterprise oriented. So you're doing like webinars, and you have like these PDF one-pagers that are about specific features.
Do you think all of these things still work, or do you think they're like overused and like people should adapt new things that work better?
Yeah, I mean, like every tactic always gets people do it because it works, and then it stops working at some point because it's overused, and then people kind of migrate to something else. But then usually it comes back around too. So for example, I know of a number of companies that were successfully doing direct mail, over the last like 4 to 8 years, and that was probably an oversubscribed channel at one point, and then stopped being an oversubscribed channel and started working again. So I think it goes in cycles.
Maybe email spam will make it back.
I mean, now it's like there are people trying to do B2B outreach on like Twitter. There are people, trying to do content marketing strategies on LinkedIn where they, write a bunch of content. I think enterprise SaaS actually, if you target a specific customer, the marketing is actually, for example, like I think you actually have it harder than someone like Lattice, for example, because like Lattice targets specifically HR professionals in the workplace, and so they can just do all this content marketing, and events and everything around, things that HR professionals are interested in, and like how they can become good at their job or better at their job, or like data that they'd be interested in, and that they can really draw in those people, and they can have this whole content marketing strategy around that.
Yeah.
It's easy to create a target profile for those people, create custom audiences in Facebook, do remarketing, like all this kind of stuff. But if your target is more just like people at startups, it's like a little bit harder. So the more precise your target is, the easier that'll be for you.
Cool. Dayton asks a good question. How do you cultivate a cult following? I think obviously Notion has one, Mercury is kind of getting one. Is there like some magic answer, or like what's the way to get a good cult following?
Oh man, I don't even know. Really, I mean, like build a product that people love, I guess. It's like
That's the easy answer.
That's really it. I think that there are some things that you can do early on in the course of your business, which is and obviously you have to have some amount of product market fit and believe things are working to be able to invest the time in focusing on this, as opposed to like scrambling to ensure you have product market fit. But to basically like over invest in like the success of your customers, and Notion provides support for everybody, regardless of if you're paying or not. And it's like very high quality support, and that's like,
I actually think support might be like the secret trick to like having a good cult following. Like you can turn people into like kind of having a bad experience to like really having a great experience. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's like sustainable all the way up until you're like a public company where you can just provide super hands-on support for everybody, regardless of if they're paying or not. But in the early days, like it's a feedback loop too. Like you're learning from those people while you're providing them support, and they're providing value back to you, and you can integrate that into your product development and be really responsive to users and all this kind of stuff. And I think that is underrated.
All right, good question from anonymous attendee. How do you think about growth for products that have a high learning curve? So I guess like Superhuman's a good example of that.
I was talking to Mercy, who ran growth at Slack pretty early on. And she had a really good thinking around this, which is like, if you think about it, I mean, now Slack is a pretty complex product. I mean, the base thing is pretty easy. You just chat with each other, but then there's like threads, and there's like, all these other private rooms and shared channels, and like all this other these other features. And I think what you really want to have is like emergent complexity. And this is what she was talking about, was having emergent complexity. So basically like trying to make your product as simple as possible for the base use cases, and then exposing people to the complexity later on. I mean, if you have a product that's really complex and people have to understand it before they can use it, it's just hard to make that successful unless you really have people coming in who know they need all the complexity. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like Excel, for example. It's like, okay, anyone can type numbers into the spreadsheet and add them together. But then there's like finance people who can just do all sorts of crazy things that I never even knew Excel could do, because they've just figured that out, but they didn't need to know that up front. And if they had to know that up front, they probably would have never started using the product in the first place.
Yeah, emerging complexity is a good one. I guess like Salesforce would be kind of a counter example to that, because a lot of their complexity is up front because you have to like configure it to your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Salesforce not as a sales. I don't think of Salesforce as a sales like CRM though. Really, I think it's a database product. And the reason why it's successful is because you have to have it, because it integrates with all the other tools you want to use. Not because it's like the best CRM product, which it's not.
How important do you think in general, like bucketing users, to think about growth is?
I mean, I think always you want to look at your users who are the most successful and understand them, and then obviously try and create more of those users. I think generally you want to do that qualitatively, though, more than quantitatively. I mean, it's like one thing to look at a bunch of numbers and be like, oh, these users are great, and then try and figure out how you can like oh, these users do this feature a lot, so like let's try and get more people to do that feature. And sometimes that works, but I think what's usually more has a better end result is to actually talk to those users and talk to them about their usage of the product and like really deeply understand how they're using it and why they're using it the way they are. And then understand the gaps between those users and your other users, and then try and solve the problem more intuitively.
I mean, is there also like, as you're exploring that, is there also, can you tie it back to the channels? Like, yeah, like this group seems to like really like this feature, so we can like target performance ads against that and things like that.
Ideally, you don't have a product where all the users behave differently and use your product in different ways, because then it's much harder to grow that type of product. So I kind of feel bad for Twitter, because that's kind of the situation they're in. They have like probably like 10 different personas of users who use the product in 10 different ways, and they have to think about making product changes that like work across all of those things, which just seems super hard. I think ideally you're trying to focus on your core, figure out what your core use cases are and expand those sets of users, rather than like try and serve all 17 different use cases of your product, which is just a challenge.
How do you think about delight features? That's kind of like a good question. Like, features that people don't necessarily ask for, that maybe the product goes kind of an extra step with, and then people like fall in love with those features. Like, how important do you think they are for kind of growth in the product?
Yeah. So I think this is a really good question, and I think it's an important distinction. So Andy Johns, who's like was early growth guy at like Facebook and Twitter and Quora, and is now a VC, has this on his blog. He actually has this like PDF doc or whatever that people should read, but it talks about the difference between like innovation and optimization and how you structure your teams within a company. And so I definitely don't think that everything at a company should be optimized for, moving some revenue number over the next like 6 months, for example, or 2 weeks, or whatever you want to say. I think that like there should be resources at the company dedicated towards product innovation, where the output goal is improving like NPS or other customer satisfaction metrics. And then there should be another team, which is like growth, which is more focused on basically optimizing rather than innovating, and just driving, the existing product forward by tweaking the knobs and like, smoothing out the invite flows and, all the different things that a growth team would typically do. So I think these delight features would fall under the innovation side. And the prioritization there would be like, okay, if we're going to invest this much engineering effort, like, is this going to either open up a new class of users for us, or is it going to make like our existing users substantially more delighted and happy with the product?
Is there like does he have a rule of thumb on like what percentage to do on each?
I think he talks about basically not having a growth team until your company is like 15 engineers, and you can feasibly split up into like 3 or 4 different teams.
Another question around content marketing. Any advice for content marketing? How do you kind of think about content marketing in general?
This works the best if you have a more specific target audience. And so, if you're like Lattice and targeting HR, or if you're like, I don't know, pick the product where you have like a definite persona that you can go after. I mean, even Mercury to some extent, right? We're talking right now, right, about startups in general and like early stage, and this is like a probably relevant audience for you. So I think basically figuring out the persona and the type of person you're trying to go after that's your core customer, and then figuring out content that will engage them and get them familiar with your brand. And then just figuring out the channels that are going to be most efficient for distributing that content to them, and experimenting with both the content and how the people react to it, and the channels and how effective they are at distributing the content to them.
All right, question from Spencer. How would you recommend structuring a new growth team for a consumer subscription product, and what's the process you would use to run the experiments?
I think that there's a few ways that people think about starting new growth teams. I think that there's kind of 2 strategies. The first is to hire, if you can, someone who is pretty senior and has the experience that could eventually build a team around them. I think that's actually like the harder strategy. I think the easier strategy is to figure out early channels that you think will work for you and hire someone who's like more mid-career to basically like run and optimize and build out those channels. And I think like a lot of times people do not invest enough effort into trying to figure out channels themselves before they're like, I need to hire a growth person. And I really think that usually the founders or someone on the leadership team has to like suck it up and basically like be the person to figure out and experiment with like the channels early on and like what the right channels are going to be and like all of that. It's really hard to outsource that. You can if you find the right person, but those people are really hard to find. And if you hire someone who's bad, you're just going to waste a bunch of time with someone who's going to either experiment with channels and they don't know enough about what they're doing that they'll think the channels don't work when they actually might work and they just didn't explore them correctly. Or well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of like the typical problem there.
All right, this is a question from the main channel. How is growth different from marketing? How do the two kind of work together?
So some companies, they will have performance marketing live under marketing. I tend to think that performance marketing does better living under growth and collaborating with marketing. I think that marketing's, role is to kind of set the overall tone and messaging for the company as a whole. And when you talk about a company that's like, I don't know, a SaaS company, you probably have like product marketing who's responsible for like product launches and like the communication of product launches. You would have marketing that's responsible for like building out, landing pages and ensuring that they're kind of on brand with whatever the brand is and they have consistent messaging. And so I think it's like has to be a very collaborative relationship. I think in the best situation you have like a marketing team who's like very responsive to the growth team and vice versa. I used to think that kind of these pure growth approaches would trump like marketing and branding and who cares if it's like on brand. You should just do whatever the thing is that's working. And I think that to some extent that may be true if the performance is like 5x better, but there are a lot of times where you want to give up a little bit of performance to like have a consistent, brand voice message, something you stand for as a company, consistent looking presence in the market. At a really early stage, I don't think it matters. I think you actually build the marketing team after the growth team most of the time, but it kind of depends. So, in my experience, it's like I work with a marketing team to generate ad and landing page assets, and it's very collaborative. It's like, oh, we want to run this, Facebook campaign or Instagram campaign or YouTube campaign, and this is kind of what we're thinking on the messaging and the offer. How do you think we should frame this? And like we'll go back and forth, and then we'll come up with tests. But like the tests are of very high quality, like marketing approved material, not just kind of like hacking stuff together. But I think like if Notion were a smaller company, or if I was working at a smaller company, there'd probably just be a growth team and we'd probably just be hacking assets together and seeing what we could do and be scrappy. So
yeah, makes sense. All right, anonymous question. I guess unlaunched product, how important do you think it's to focus on the initial launch versus like kind of longer term growth?
I think everyone focuses on the initial launch too much, and that like almost everybody, and that over indexes on like a small number of examples like Superhuman or Gmail or something like that. Maybe if you have an email product, you should focus on the initial launch, and then if you have any other product, you should just get it out there and talk to users and figure it out from there.
Yeah,
I think like there is an argument like for people who really are experienced to build a product and get it in front of a core set of users and make it really, really good, and then launch it to like a broader market. But I think that's like a strategy where you have to really know what you're doing, or it's very easy to kind of fail. I know that's kind of like what, Sahel is trying to do with, who's the Mixpanel founder, who's building like a new product now. He's trying to take that approach, and I think people have taken that approach successfully. But if you're going to take that approach, you really have to be intentional about like ensuring you're talking to users on a regular basis and they're giving you real feedback that's accurate and not sugar-coated.
This is a fun question. Have you seen any kind of newer startups that you've seen impressive kind of growth campaigns or growth channels or growth ideas from?
I don't know. I think there's like a lot more channels out there than there used to be, and a lot of opportunities to do things. There's like influencer stuff, which is like underutilized, I think. And I've seen some kind of recent examples of that working for some folks. I don't know. There's Reddit ads that I used to run.
If we should definitely do more of those.
There's like, I think like less obscure, but I think people really only started to figure out Instagram stories ads and stuff over the last like 12 to 18 months. And in terms of really running that stuff well at scale, I think that product was out for quite a while before people really figured it out. Yeah, I'll keep thinking about this. If I come up with a better answer before the end of this, I'll bring it up.
I thought it was a good answer. Let's see. What do you, when you're thinking about kind of growth goals, like setting goals, doing projections, what do you think is a good way to do them? Like, do you want to be like ambitious on the goal, or do you try to be conservative on it? Like, how do you think about that stuff?
I think you want like ambitious but achievable goals, like just generally not even related to growth. If you're using like an OKR framework or something like that, ambitious but achievable. On the growth side, I do like the breaking down the goal into kind of more discrete monthly or weekly kind of numbers, and then just trying to do stuff to hit those numbers. And obviously some of the growth projects are like more longer term, might take a month or 6 weeks to implement something, but ideally you can ship lots of experiments or growth features on like a regular cadence, try and continuously make progress.
What do you think it's a good attributes to like a good growth hire? Like, what would you look for if you were looking for like, this, let's just assume small startup and this is your first or second hire or something?
Yeah, I think two things that I always look for are, I always think of like the ability to break down a growth problem into like all the discrete components. So like, can you take a growth problem at a company, like say you're responsible for growth at like, I don't know, Yelp or something like that, and break it down into like all the component parts of like the different things you can do. I think that's really important because you want to figure out where you have the most leverage, and in order to do that, you have to basically be able to break the entire problem down into as discrete chunks as possible, and then be able to analyze like how you're performing at each of those, and then think about where you have the most leverage. And then the second one is like just prioritization. I think that it sounds easy, but a lot of people are not good at prioritizing things by just basic effort and impact matrix. And I think that's a really important skill set. And then obviously to be able to do either of those things, you have to be pretty analytically minded. For product hiring, I almost think like SQL and data analysis should be a prerequisite for everything except for maybe like the most entry level of candidates, just because I think it's so important to be able to do your own analysis as a PM and be able to think in data.
All right, that's a good kind of mark to stop on. Any last words, Jamie?
I don't think so. This was fun.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for taking the time. So other people can also see it.
Cool.
All right.
See ya.